This is a Fox News alert. Justice Department official Bruce Orr right now facing questions on Capitol Hill amid new revelations about his numerous contacts with the author of the infamous Trump dossier, ex-British spy Christopher Steele. This is Outnumbered. I'm Katie Pavlich, and here today, Fox News correspondent Molly Line, Fox News contributor Lisa Boothe, former director of strategic communications for Hillary Clinton, Adrienne Elrod, and joining us on the couch today for the first time, Christian Whiton, former senior State Department advisor for President Donald Trump and George W. Bush, and senior fellow at the Center for National Interest. You are outnumbered for
Welcome,
the first time.
Christian.
Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're very happy to have your expertise in the State Department for President Bush and President Trump here today. So,
couple things that are on your level of experience with this show today.
yeah, we've got just a couple things. So we will get to the news as soon as we get to it. All right, here's video of DOJ official Bruce Orr this morning heading into a closed-door interview before the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees. Much of that interview expected to focus on the anti-Trump dossier, which was being funded by the DNC and Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign. Fox's chief intelligence correspondent Catherine Herridge catching up with Orr in the hallways of Capitol Hill. Watch.
Mr. Orr, we have a series of questions from Fox News. Mr. Orr, who authorized your contact with the FBI? Did anyone within the Justice Department know you were contacting the FBI as a back channel for Christopher Steele, the British spy?
Not much interest in answering any questions. Orr has links to Fusion GPS, the opposition research firm behind the Trump dossier. Glenn Simpson, co-founder of Fusion GPS, hired Steele, and Orr's wife, Nellie, also worked for Fusion GPS as a contractor during the 2016 campaign. Republican Mark Meadows taking part in the interview today, saying that he believes 99% of DOJ and FBI workers are patriots, but the actions of some officials should raise alarm bells. Watch.
I think our republic in the integrity of the FBI and DOJ is at stake. We have about 7 or 8 that took things into their own hand, and so it's the credibility of really Lady Justice that should have a blindfold, and yet we're seeing that they were peeking and trying to tilt justice one way or another based on their own political bias.
So, Christian, we'll go to you first and get your take on this as a former employee of the government. It's probably not a good thing that he's getting hauled up from his perspective to answer these questions. We're going to hear a little bit about what happened based on what we are told by Congressman answering the questions. But what is your perspective about what's going on today?
Yeah, it's never good if you're a bureaucrat to suddenly be on the front of newspapers and being featured in every news story, at least anyone who's bothering to report this. You know, this is part of the 99% of the FBI being patriots, I think, is a great statistics, because if this type of phony evidence were to arrive at an FBI field office out in real America, it would have been discounted. The Steele dossier would have never seen the light of day. Average FBI agents have to meet very high standards of evidence. And yet you see, again, with Orr and his colleagues, the FBI lovers, a politicized headquarters of the FBI, and not just one that was there under President Obama, one that has continued under Jeff Sessions, who has sort of not ever gotten control of this department.
So, Lisa, Bruce Orr is there today voluntarily, but there could have been a question of subpoena moving forward if he wasn't willing to come testify behind closed doors about his involvement with the dossier and Christopher Steele.
Right, and lawmakers have been trying to get him to talk, I think, for about 9 months now. And the reason why Bruce Orr is of such interest is because of his connections to the unverified dossier that was used to obtain a FISA warrant on Carter Page. And those connections are serving as an intermediary between Christopher Steele, the author of the dossier, and the FBI, even after he was fired for violating FBI rules by leaking to the press, and also his wife, Nellie Orr, that worked for Fusion GPS. And what I'm certainly interested in is the fact in documents that were turned over to Congress, Orr had written that Christopher Steele said that Comey's firing made him nervous that that would expose them. So what are you worried about being exposed? And you can look at things about, Nellie Orr, the fact that he was fired, still being used as a source. Troubling, he failed to write that his wife worked for Fusion GPS in ethics forums. Rod Rosenstein also wasn't aware that he was serving as an intermediary. So there are a lot of things here that I think Congress are going to try to get to the bottom of.
And there's a question of the funding here, Adrienne, and the connection to the Clinton campaign. Is it appropriate for someone who is working in the Department of Justice to be in contact with an opposition research firm that was being paid by the Clinton campaign?
Well, we do know that his wife worked there, right? So, like, Washington, D.C. is a small place. There's a lot of people who
but directly the tie to the Clinton campaign in terms of the funding going for the dossier.
Again, we've talked about this so many times. It was opposition research, which was in a dossier. So, again, you're using facts here when you're using fact-based evidence that is backed up by citations, which is what was in this dossier.
Are you saying the dossier is true? Because that's been proven.
I'm saying, well, no,
false.
but there are absolutely things in the dossier that are true. Absolutely.
Like what?
But we're talking about Bruce Orr right now.
Right, and Bruce Orr is connected to the dossier through his wife, who helped fund the research and do the research.
But here's the
about
point.
The Clinton campaign and their involvement with the Justice Department under Obama to go after an opposition party.
Here's the point that I think that we need to be looking at here. Why are Republicans holding this hearing today in a closed-door format, right? If they really think that Bruce Orr has a lot to say, then open it up. Let's be transparent. Let's have an open hearing as opposed to a closed-door hearing. I mean, look, we'll see what happens today from this hearing. We'll see if Republicans leak anything out or if they, give a public statement post the hearing. But again, I think this is just another.
But isn't it a conflict of interest if his wife worked for Fusion GPS and he's still serving as an intermediary after Christopher Steele was fired with the FBI?
I don't think it. I think absolutely. I don't think it's a conflict of interest at all because I think that
Why do you think he failed to put that on ethics forms, though?
I think, well, he probably should have. Again, there's a lot of information that we need to know, but I think it's completely unfair to tie him to something just because his wife was involved in something.
Well, this does seem to be the beginning of the fact-finding behind closed doors.
But I think that
we have an interview coming up in the next hour with Congressman Darrell Issa, who's been in there, and of course I would imagine he's asking a lot of questions about conflict of interest, about potential biases, and just kind of the fact-finding here. We know that Christopher Steele got the boot in 2016 in November, and yet information was still being funneled. And Bruce Orr, we know from some text messages that Catherine Herridge, through her exceptional reporting, has brought to light, had showed that there was some communication still going on.
Then why it's not an open hearing?
I want to get to Congressman Mark Meadows and what he wants to ask Bruce Orr, and then I'm going to get Christian's reaction.
I think that later reporting today would suggest that perhaps the involvement, who authorized Bruce Orr to get involved, if there was someone who did that, those are the critical questions that have to be answered.
Christian, reaction?
Yeah, who did what when? I mean, really, how this thing was set in motion. The dossier was fundamentally fake. It had fake information that Donald Trump was compromised. It said that people were places that they weren't, like in Prague. That was used to send spies into the Trump campaign. And just to circle back to an earlier point, all of this activity at the Justice Department should be known by now. We're a year and a half into the Trump administrations. And again, Jeff Sessions, and it's not just the Russia thing. He's been fundamentally disappointing on a number of things, like going after sanctuary cities, antitrust against these big guys in Silicon Valley, enforcing the Second Amendment and judicial things. It's really just sort of a mess over there at the Justice Department.
Also, to Adrienne's earlier point, I don't think we know if we don't know what conversations happened behind the scenes with congressional investigators and Bruce Orr and his team. So I don't think we know if he would have even accepted speaking into an open forum in an open hearing. So, I mean, that could also be part of.
And you can also be dealing with classified information, which is why maybe Congressman wanted to have an open conversation behind closed doors, also without the media fanfare that comes with these open hearings, as we saw when Peter Strzok testified. You had Democrats standing up and applauding during the hearing and doing everything they could.
And it takes some of that political drama away and
take away and try to get to the substance and the questions.
But we also know that when Republicans have held a lot of these closed door hearings, information is selectively leaked out, and that's why I think
Adam
it's important.
Schiff never leaks anything.
That's why I think it's important that you have these open hearings when possible.
Christian, I think you want to respond to her, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
I think the more that we get out, this may have actually been at Orr's risk. He is supposedly playing ball to an extent with the investigators. We'll see after today. So, but yeah, we do need to get all the facts on this out in the public and understand why the Obama administration decided to spy on the Trump campaign based on phony evidence.
Okay, all right.
And the public, of course, interested as well. So hopefully we will get a few details out of there, maybe perhaps later on today. Michael Cohen's lawyer, Lanny Davis, backing off two bombshell claims that he made about President Trump in an interview with the Washington Post. Davis now admitting he was the anonymous source in a July CNN story that reported Cohen had privately claimed President Trump knew in advance about that infamous Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and some Russians. Also the source on that story for the Post. Here is Davis making those claims last week. Watch.
I can only say that he was present during a discussion with Junior and Dad. Mr. Cohen has knowledge on certain subjects that should be of interest to the special counsel. I believe that Mr. Cohen has direct knowledge that would be of interest to Mr. Mueller that suggests, I'm not sure it proves, that Mr. Trump was aware of Russian government agents hacking illegally.
And Davis is now expressing regret for his role in all of this, saying, quote, "I should have been more clear that I could not independently confirm what happened. I regret my error." Davis also saying he can't corroborate his claim that Cohen has information suggesting Trump knew in advance about Russian hacking of the DNC servers during the 2016 election, saying, "I'm not sure. There's a possibility that's the case, but I am not sure." So to kick things off, Lisa, I want to start with you. Is he just using and abusing the press? Should they have seen this coming? He's a longtime partisan.
Well, I think he's full of it, obviously. And if we're just being honest, yeah, he's completely full of it. And also, yeah, I mean, I think he understands that the press hates Trump so much that they'll pretty much report whatever is given to them that's negative to President Trump. But I think the big thing here is that we keep seeing these bombshell stories that would dramatically change sort of the way that the entire Russia investigation is viewed that end up being wrong. And you go back to even with ABC Brian Ross reporting that President Trump as a candidate told Flynn to talk to the Russians when really it was when he was president-elect, which is basically standard operating procedure and isn't even a story. Or CNN with Donald Trump Jr. somehow that he had access to the WikiLeaks dump before it was released, when in fact it was after, when everyone in the world had access to the WikiLeaks dump. So we just keep seeing these really big stories that would potentially change the way all this is viewed that end up being wrong. And so I think when President Trump says fake news, these stories just solidify that and bring people into his camp that are like, yeah, you're right. There is fake news out there.
And Lisa, to your point, Christian, I want to bring you in. These were the stories that a lot of Democrats were waiting for. See, I knew it. Trump knew about the meeting. We knew it all along. Look, here's the proof. And then, no, not the case. And it's walked back.
Right. And fundamentally, you had just this hope that there was some collusion between Trump and Russia that has gone by the wayside, essentially. And so then there was this great hope that Trump's personal lawyer would have all these goods, and now he's under pressure and he'll spill them to the press. That's the hope. And then you see the reality. You know, it's so weird in the first place, maybe not so much, that Michael Cohen, very interesting guy. I mean, if you were writing a political novel and wrote this guy in, your editor would say that's too over the top.
Like,
take it out.
there's so many characters, really, in the whole saga.
Yeah, it is. I mean, someone who taped their client, who charged AT&T $600 grand for insight on their client. I mean, I'd hate to think of what a lawyer that I've used would do that. And then hiring Lanny Davis, who is, political operative who worked for the Clintons, who is a sort of an attack dog at times for the Clintons. It's really, and then, of course, to plead guilty for something that's actually not a crime, the campaign finance violations that he pled guilty of, not a crime. And really what he decided is to play to the left. He's going to become a poster child for the left, and maybe that'll get him a lighter sentence somehow from Mueller, from the term prosecutors up here, and just doesn't really seem to be working.
Well, President Trump did warn people against using Michael Cohen as a lawyer.
Yeah, he did. My favorite thing about this is Lanny Davis trying to say that he made a mistake when, based on the fact that he is a Clinton operative and has been for 20 years, the idea that this was a mistake is bogus. He knew exactly what he was doing. And the problem is that the accusation that was made is a very serious one. Lanny Davis, as an anonymous source, accused the president, when he was a candidate, of knowing about a meeting that, accused him of that, and then walked it back and said, actually, my client didn't know anything about that meeting, meaning Michael Cohen, and then saying that the president, of course, didn't know about the meeting. So he made this huge accusation, made the president look like he was lying about it, and now there are certain people in the media who won't retract the story as they should.
Well, but CNN also says they have multiple anonymous sources.
But how can you trust any of those?
Multiple Lanny Davises?
Yeah.
If they're anonymous sources are people like Lanny Davis,
well, but that's not why they're retracting
your
the
former
story,
candidate, then they should really think about
because they say that they have multiple sources.
How can you trust any of them?
The other source was Lanny Davis just using a different voice.
The other source was Michael Cohen, Lanny Davis.
Or someone tweeted it's Danny Davis.
Yeah.
Get it? Just switch it.
Well, I just want to add to your little screenplay here that it is kind of insane that you've got Lanny Davis representing Michael Cohen and you've got Rudy Giuliani representing Donald Trump. So that just adds to this whole sort of, you know, the Hollywood screenplay you could never write.
And
been an
does that
interesting
speak
August.
to the media using these anonymous sources and believing things too quickly, particularly when you know people's backgrounds?
But they use the anonymous. Lanny Davis is not a whistleblower who needs protection, who is working deep inside a government agency and is fearing retribution for speaking out anonymously. That is when you use anonymous sources, when there are people who look at corruption, know corruption is going on, and they need protection in the press because they're trying to get their story out. Lanny Davis, and as a journalist you should know, is a political operative, and he shouldn't be able to operate anonymously as a source because he has nothing to lose. He is not needing protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act. He is a political operative trying to get his word out in an anonymous piece to accuse the president of lying about a meeting that has to do with the Mueller investigation.
And we'll see, too. I'm very interested in seeing how Lanny Davis now moving forward in some of these interviews is what sort of credibility, what lens do people look at him through?
Is credibility completely burned, and also the credibility of Michael Cohen, and what does this mean for his
he already
client?
kind of lacked credibility to begin with, so this really
But I also
help.
think it's important not to forget that Rudy Giuliani has also made a lot of discrepancies in the media, too. So, I mean, he's had to walk back some comments as well. So
There's a difference between Rudy Giuliani walking it back and the media not correcting it. Lanny Davis has walked it back, but there are certain people and reporters who have refused to correct the record, and they should if they want to maintain any kind of credibility on the story that they wrote.
All right, we are about to get a new read on the high-stakes midterms as voters head to the polls for primaries in 3 states today. The big races we are watching and the potential impact for both parties and for President Trump's agenda. Plus, the White House touting the president's trade agreement with Mexico. Will Canada also jump on board? What it all means for workers and businesses here at home.
It opens up a lot of markets. It protects intellectual property. It actually extends some patents and copyrights for new drugs. All this is very helpful. It protects workers.
Fox News alert, voters heading to the polls right now in Arizona, Florida, and Oklahoma as the primary season winds to a close. Many of these races are another big test of President Trump's influence in the Republican Party. Among today's races, taking the focus, Florida's GOP Senate primary, the president endorsing Republican Governor Rick Scott, who's facing off against businessman Rocky De La Fuente. Also in Florida, the primary race for governor, the president backing Congressman Ron DeSantis over the state's Commissioner of Agriculture, Adam Putnam. And in Arizona, my home state, 3 GOP candidates are competing in a fierce Senate primary. Congresswoman Martha McSally, former state senator Kelly Ward, and former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, all running for the seat now held by Senator Jeff Flake. The race also being watched closely following the death of Arizona Senator John McCain. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey will select the late senator's replacement. So, Christian, the president's been pretty successful in his primary endorsements so far. Where do you see this going?
I think McSally is led in all of the polls, and all the indications are that she'll prevail. And she'll have, of course, a full term of the seat vacated by Flake, of course, a senator who was very outspoken against Donald Trump and didn't, frankly, want to face voters again because voters, especially in the Republican primary, probably would have fired him. Corker from Tennessee in that same boat, and we'll see about Ben Sasse from Nebraska as far as these primary critics of Trump. Trump very popular in Republican circles. Of course, the governor has a challenge in deciding who to fill the seat vacated by late Senator John McCain. Choices between perhaps one of the runner-ups probably not Sheriff Joe, it'd probably be Kelly Ward in today's primary, or to go with someone who's already been in Congress like John Kyle, the former senator. Yeah, and his chief of staff, I also think, is in the running for that position. But Lisa, the president has been successful in this, all but 2 out of 37 races. He has successfully endorsed the primary candidate for Republicans in Senate, House, and governor's races all across the country. How do you think he's going to fare today? Do you think Ron DeSantis is going to pull it out, or is Pam Bondi's endorsement going to win the day?
I think DeSantis pulls it off, which would be a good test of President Trump's power in, the endorsement process, because DeSantis was behind Putnam, and now it looks like he's made up that lead, and I think he does pull it off. My understanding is they're both polling essentially the same in the general election, so I don't really think it makes too big of a difference. Also, President Trump's approval rating in Florida is around 50% now, so I think Democrats are going to try to make this an anti-Trump thing, but I don't necessarily think that's going to be super effective for them there. Also, Obviously, in Arizona, I think Martha McSally is going to pull it off and win soundly, which is a positive thing. It's a good thing because there will be a tough general election there, and she will most definitely fare better in the general election than Ward or Arpaio would.
Yeah, Adrienne, there's concern among Republicans in Arizona about the Democratic nominee for Senate, Kirsten Sinema. What's your inside information on how they think that race is going to go for the general election?
Yeah, I think the DSCC is certainly looking at this race as a potential pickup for Democrats. Kirsten Sinema is a very moderate Democrat. She's somebody who's very popular in the state. So we'll see how these three duke it out today. I think going back to, another factor to keep in mind about today is that Governor Ducey, of course, is also in cycle, but he has a responsibility of picking John McCain's replacement. So he's made it clear that he's going to wait until after the services of Senator McCain, but he is also going to have the pressure of picking somebody who is either in the Donald Trump part of the GOP vein or somebody who is more moderate in line. And
so do you think he'll look at this race and use it to read tea leaves?
Well, I think he's got a lot of pressure, right? Because number one, he is in cycle, so he has to consider whoever he picks that will potentially affect him.
I think that's overblown, though. I think all that's overblown. I mean, he's going to be reelected based on his time serving. I think whoever he picks to fill the late Senator McCain's seat is somewhat irrelevant. I just think there's so much being made over it with the whole Trump phenomenon and all that. I don't think it's that big of a deal.
President Trump is very popular in Arizona, so I do think that there is some risk to Ducey picking someone who is too, quote, moderate on the Republican side. John McCain did face re-election multiple times and had challengers each of those times from the right. And so Doug Ducey does have to make this decision.
But he still always won. I mean, even against...
He did always win, but he had this machine behind him, and now it's an open playing field. So I do think there's some political risk of Doug Ducey not picking someone who is to the right enough and on the side of Trump rather than more in the middle.
I don't know. I'm just not buying that. But I mean, I get the reporting on it. I don't buy it.
Yeah, and shifting gears to Florida, one of the big questions there is the Democrats are really trying to reclaim the governor's seat there in that state. Do you think that's a potential possibility depending on which candidate they end up with in Florida?
Yeah, I think it's a potential possibility.
You've held that for decades.
I know. In Florida, Florida is such a challenging state. The saying goes, I think, on the Democratic and Republican side, if you're a campaign operative who can win Florida for your candidate, that's a big deal because it is basically three separate states in one state, right? You've got northern Florida, which is very southern, very much like Alabama. You've got the middle of the state, which is, sort of the core of Florida. Then you've got the southern part of the state, which is very, heavily Cuban, a strong Cuban population and a Hispanic population.
Are you worried about Bill Nelson? Because he's sort of proven to be a pretty horrible candidate.
I believe there are Democrats who are worried about Bill Nelson. I believe that the Bill Nelson machine will prevail.
Is there one, though? Because they're really not. And he's embarrassed himself
he's
quite a bit so
reelected
far.
quite a few times. So I think he will prevail, but I think it's going to be a tough race.
This could be a big change, a big pickup for Republicans in a number of states. There are obvious ones like North Dakota, but Florida and others, specifically Missouri, maybe Montana, West Virginia, really a big change and, a change in this whole blue wave dynamic. And another thing with Florida, I think likely retaining Republican governor, it eliminates the ability of the Democratic Party to generate stars outside of its left-wing progressive Washington atmosphere.
Exactly. Well, we will be watching and covering it here right on Fox News Channel. But in the meantime, Secretary of Defense James Mattis making a new announcement with tensions between the U.S. and North Korea on the rise after President Trump suddenly canceled Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's trip to Pyongyang. Now the Defense Department saying future military exercises on the peninsula will go forward. So what does this mean for efforts to denuclearize North Korea? We're glad to have former State Department Advisor Christian Whiton here to weigh in on that. So stay tuned.
We took the step to suspend several of the largest exercises as a good faith measure coming out of the Singapore summit. We have no plans at this time to suspend any more exercises.
Fox News Alert, Defense Secretary James Mattis announcing that the U.S. is not considering plans to suspend additional military exercises on the Korean Peninsula amid renewed tension between the United States and North Korea. Here's Secretary Mattis.
We took the step to suspend several of the largest exercises as a good faith measure coming out of the Singapore summit. We will work very closely, as I said, with the Secretary of State, and what he needs done, we will certainly do to reinforce his effort, but at this time, there is no discussion about further suspensions.
And this comes just days after President Trump abruptly called off Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's planned trip to Pyongyang. The president citing a lack of progress on North Korean denuclearization. The Washington Post reports that the president halted the trip due to a reportedly belligerent letter that Pompeo received from a North Korean official. In response, North Korean state media criticizing the Trump administration, writing, "The U.S. is hatching a criminal plot to unleash war against North Korea and commit a crime which deserves merciless divine punishment." Pretty strong words there from North Korea amongst the state media. I mean, how seriously do we take those words? They seem to have some pretty creative writers over there in North Korea.
They do. 1950s style propaganda.
Right, exactly. And to a certain extent, that, of course, is aimed for their own people. But at the same time, we do receive the messages here in the United States as well. So what does this mean going forward? Are we stuck at an impasse? And the fact that Mattis has said, you know, things will be back to business as usual if you can't move towards denuclearization.
Right. A bunch of signals now from the president and from Mattis that we are nearing sort of the end phase, potentially, of our patience. You know, the North Koreans have got to stop sending messages like that because, yeah, they're important. And more importantly, Donald Trump thinks they're important. You remember the Singapore summit originally was on, and then they came out with a statement to North Koreans threatening Vice President Pence, threatening to nuke America. And Trump said, thanks, but no thanks, we're canceling it. And then North Korea did an about face, and it was back on. Incidentally, that previous digression came after Kim Jong-un met with the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, in Dalian, China. And that the president has identified as basically a factor causing North Korea to go from, well, maybe they're willing to come in from the cold and reform to back to bad behavior. And the president pointed that out again recently. And also, you know, he understands China's leverage over North Korea. He's not the first president to do that. He is the first president in recent times to link it to trade. And that's what he did in a tweet, saying basically, you know, this is why they're misbehaving.
Yeah, and that was particularly fascinating. Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I was say it's a very good thing that the military exercises are back on. As Mattis said, they were taken away in good faith or suspended, but it was also at the time suspending a legal action, which are military exercises with allies, in exchange for the stopping of illegal belligerent behavior, which is threatening the United States with nuclear war. And now that we haven't seen any progress, I'm happy to see that those things are back on, despite, as the president said, the costs of them. I'm curious to know if the letter, the belligerent letter that was sent to Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, was as big as the letter that was sent to President Trump in the Oval Office. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but it would be funny to see if they sent the same type of letter.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see if a meeting ever does get rescheduled and how much China would ultimately play in that, since that seems to be where a lot of the leverage is leaning right now. Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, I was going to say, I think, too, you know, remember that Kim Jong-un came to the negotiating table because of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign, ramping up sanctions aggressively against North Korea and also with the military threats as well. You know, remember back in the day, Kim Jong-un was Rocket Man and Fire and Fury and, you know, you better be afraid of us, and sort of ramped up rhetoric that Kim Jong-un and North Korea really haven't seen from prior administrations. So I think that still retaining some of that pressure, and Kim Jong-un knowing that we're not afraid to go back to that point with maximum pressure is important, because President Trump has repeatedly said, I'm not afraid to walk away from the table. So I think it's important to demonstrate that we aren't, because one of the big problems with President Obama and the Iran deal was the fact that that was his legacy. That was what he was so concerned about, that he wouldn't walk away even if it's a crappy deal, and he still signed it. So I think it's important that North Korea knows that we're not willing to sign a bad deal, and we're willing to walk away if we don't get something that is okay with us.
But I think it's also important to take a step back and remember that in June of this year, just a couple months ago, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un stood together with the United States flag and the North Korean flag and Donald Trump said North Korea is no longer a threat. And now we are seeing this, whatever diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, completely unravel. So I think the administration needs to come forward, set the record straight with the American people, and put in place a diplomatic process that will actually yield the results that we want.
This administration is certainly trying things that are new, which can make what comes a little less predictable than perhaps things have been in prior years and under prior administrations. So where could we potentially go from here? Doesn't that mean there's a broad spectrum of possibilities?
There is, and I don't think we're worse off for what the president has tried to do. I mean, we've gone about a year now longer without a North Korean nuclear test, without ballistic missile testing. They've dismantled partially their rocket assembly facility, their nuclear test site. So these are good signs. And also, we sort of changed the flip the script, where China was the facilitator of all diplomacy in this, in both the Clinton and the Bush administration, in which I first served, to one where we are dealing directly and our leverage can come into effect. So it's very easy to go back to maximum pressure because we never really stopped doing that, except for that minor military drill that now, rescheduled or back on. And those are important to keep South Korea.
A small sign forward, yeah.
Right. And also, there's a lot we can sanction as well. We can go after the money. North Korea's illicit funds from abroad is how the regime survives. In 2006, we sanctioned a bank that was laundering their money. The bank was in Macau. A lot of pressure both on the bank and on the really near death sentences for both the bank and the regime.
And there have been some signals that could be the next thing coming. All right, well, coming up, liberal groups fighting against the confirmation of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, now going after Senate Democrats who have not committed to opposing him, whether the resistance could work or will it damage certain Democrats.
As we challenge the Kavanaugh nomination, to understand that we've got to knock on doors and take back the House and gut this nomination.
Fox News alert: progressive groups launching a campaign this week to block President Trump's Supreme Court Justice nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. The Whip the Vote campaign is aimed at 24 Senate Democrats who have not yet vowed to oppose Kavanaugh. The hearings for his confirmation begin 1 week from today. 3 of those Democratic senators are the usual suspects: Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp, and Joe Manchin. They're from red states and face re-election in November. The 3 voted for Trump's first high court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, and they are the most likely to vote for Kavanaugh. At one event yesterday, speakers went after Republicans Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, claiming that their decision on Kavanaugh will determine the future of abortion rights in America. Watch.
You both hold the fate of approximately 93 million women of childbearing age in your hands. With this vote on Brett Kavanaugh, you will be defining the future of these women, these 93 million women, with one vote.
Stop it! Stop it now! And make sure we have a Democratic House to have a break on this president after the 2018 elections.
Adrienne, really? The lives of 93 million childbearing age women are dependent on the Kavanaugh nomination?
Well, look, here's what we've got to remember. Donald Trump, during the campaign, made it clear that any Supreme Court nominee that he had the opportunity to nominate if he were president, he would run a litmus test on whether or not they would overturn Roe v. Wade. And he wanted nominees who would vow to overturn Roe v. Wade. So that is what is at stake here. There is a lot at stake. And that's why you're seeing all of these progressive organizations, from Demand Justice to NARAL to, you name them, they're all aligned. The resistance is aligned here to put pressure on Senate Democrats to oppose this nomination. So it's a smart tactic. It shows that Democrats are energized and enthusiastic, but at the same time, there is a lot at stake. So to try to downplay this and suggest that Kavanaugh would not do this is false. Because again,
I find it very
clear.
interesting that Democrats still are claiming to speak for 93 million women as if they all speak the same or think the same. But Christian, is this just another delay tactic by Democrats that is futile, considering that there are some Democrats who probably vote for Kavanaugh? He essentially has a nomination in the bag.
Well, I love everything about this story and this effort. As a Trump Republican, I think these should do exactly what they're advising here, which is to send these senators who are all facing tough re-elections in states that states that overwhelmingly voted for Trump, on a kamikaze mission. Kavanaugh is going to be confirmed. The big Democrat complaint against him is that he isn't vetted. He was a federal judge for 12 years. I think we know what he thinks. Before that, he was in the White House. He was vetted for that position, too. And I think it just shows how politicized and how absurd this has come. If you look back, Elena Kagan confirmed, but with 63 votes, quite a few Republicans voting in favor of her. Go back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, 97 yes votes in the Senate. And now expecting that all Democrats would vote against him. Incidentally, in Kavanaugh's rounds with senators, he has told people that Roe versus Wade is settled law. And the focus of social conservatism has changed. Frankly, it's political correctness and other rights, not so much that.
And the problem with the argument that Adrienne is making is when you drill in these red states like Manchin, Donnelly, and Heitkamp, the majority of voters in those states want Kavanaugh confirmed. And I guarantee you that Joe Manchin cares more about what Trump supporters in his state that went for President Trump by 42 points, what they care about, versus a bunch of progressive hacks. So the point is, these arguments that they're making, it has taken a toll on Kavanaugh, nationally speaking, in his numbers. But what is important is what these red state Democrats care about and what they're hearing. And they're hearing more. They care more, again, about what Trump supporters and people in their state that voted for him care about than a bunch of, crazy progressives.
Well, first of all, these quote unquote crazy progressives that you speak of are actually representing the views of a lot of Americans.
Of the left-wing base of the party.
They are representing the views.
States like Indiana, West Virginia, or North Dakota.
But there are a lot of Democrats in those states who do not want Kavanaugh
people there. But I'm talking about voters that these senators that are running for re-election in red states, what they care about.
Well, I will concede that if you are Joe Donnelly, if you are Joe Manchin, if you are Heidi Heitkamp, and you are in cycle, this is a tough vote.
And that's all
the Democrats have to show that we're fighting, and we are, and we are putting the pressure on these senators to at least give a very, very, very...
I think it'll be really tough, particularly in West Virginia, as you brought up, Lisa, because this is a state that President Trump has come back to several times. As far as coal country is concerned, there are a lot of voters that are way behind him.
And his popularity has declined significantly in West Virginia.
It would still be very challenging for Senator Manchin to come out and be the one that draws the wall on Kavanaugh. I don't know that politically speaking, somewhere down the road, he would need to make that fight.
The nominations are behind him
too, so this is happening.
Right. The nomination hearings for Brett Kavanaugh start on Tuesday, and we will be covering that here as well. In the meantime, President Trump announcing a tentative new trade deal with Mexico to replace NAFTA. But for now, Canada is not part of it. Could our neighbor to the north spoil the deal? And can the president make good on his campaign promises to remake trade? We'll debate that up next.
It shows you two sides with goodwill can sit down and work out what is essentially a free trade deal, fair trade, and get it going. Nobody thought we could do it. I think to the president's credit, to Bob Lighthizer credit, to Jared Kushner's credit, we did it. And it's going to promote economic growth both sides of the border, in my judgment.
White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow praising a potentially landmark trade deal with Mexico. The tentative new agreement the president announced yesterday stands to benefit the auto industry, which had been a sticking point in negotiations. Canada has not signed on to any deal so far, and its trade minister travels to Washington today for negotiations. The Wall Street Journal editorial board is not impressed, writing, "This is half a NAFTA that contains some improvements, but is notably worse in many ways." The president responding to critics, tweeting, "I smile at senators and others talking about how good free trade is for the U.S. What they don't say is that we lose jobs and over $800 billion a year on really dumb trade deals. And these same countries tariff us to death. These lawmakers are just fine with this." So, Christian, you wrote an op-ed for FoxNews.com, and it was titled that this is a huge win, and just note, Y-U-G-E, not huge, win for the United States. How is it a win?
I can't take credit for the huge. That was a layout editor, but I like the title. It was a big win. The Wall Street Journal editorial page has been a bunch of negative Nancy's throughout this whole process. They said tariffs don't work. It's just going to make everything worse. But in fact, it has brought people to the negotiating table. Why is it a big win? Mexico has taken jobs from the U.S., in particular manufacturing jobs, by underpricing us on labor and by having environmental and other standards that are way below what ours are. So what this deal does, it requires a $16 minimum wage for 40 to 45% of the manufacturing goods that go into the auto sector. That'll raise wages, especially in northern Mexico. So that will help some workers there, but it'll also allow us to compete more fairly with them. There are other big changes in a way that, frankly, companies could step outside of our judicial system and the Mexican judicial system that will be more restricted under this new U.S.-Mexico agreement. And more importantly, it's just a template that can now be followed, if they want to follow it, by Canada, by the EU, and maybe even China. It shows how to get to yes with Donald Trump.
And Adrienne, I want to get into the politics of this for a minute. So President Trump appealed to a lot of voters who felt left behind by the Obama administration, working class voters that Hillary Clinton, quite frankly, didn't make much of an effort to connect with, not stepping foot in a state like Wisconsin. So looking ahead at 2020, but looking ahead at 2020, how are you worried that Democrats are going to be left further behind with these working class voters if he's able to chalk up some wins for them?
No, absolutely not, because first of all, he has done nothing for these white working class voters in middle America who elected him so far.
Didn't Christian just lay out ways that he did with this deal?
Nothing is
well,
a big
but
word.
first of all, this deal is also not binding. I mean, this deal has got to be passed by Congress. We don't even have the Mexican president fully on board yet, and he's still talking to the Canadian Prime Minister. So there's still a lot of unknowns. But yes, of course, as Americans, we want to see a trade deal that works. There's a lot of concerns that people have with NAFTA, a lot of improvements that need to be made there. So we'll see what happens. But to insinuate that this deal getting passed is magically going to put working class voters, back to work in some of these parts of the country where the manufacturing base has been significantly lost.
Well, at least the president isn't saying we're going to put them
growth.
right.
You have unemployment low as it's ever been, especially for minority groups. You have wages rising, but not other inflation. And now you have
wages
even more
are not
manufacturing.
rising at the levels they need to be rising.
Well, and we've also seen hundreds of thousands of jobs added for the manufacturing sector as well.
The president isn't going into these states and saying we're going to get rid of your jobs like Hillary Clinton did in West Virginia by saying we're going to put coal miners out of business. So this situation with NAFTA, it's progress. Is there a long way to go? Yes. And I find it amazing, again, that Democrats for years, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, have called for NAFTA reform. And when President Trump gets a step there,
we've got to go. All right. Well, more Outnumbered in just a moment, so stay tuned.
Well, thank you very much to Christian Whiton for coming to the couch. We hope that you come back.
Well, thanks. It's been great to be here.
What are your predictions on Canada? Will the president get them to the table?
I think so. On Mexico, it's going to get signed in November. It'll get passed in the House, in the Congress early next year. Canada will fold, probably the EU.
All right. Well, we are back. Yeah, big predictions. We're back tomorrow at noon Eastern. Molly Lyon is in for Harris.